Welcome to the podcast, Quoc and Roll. I am your host, Quoc Hui Lan. Today, I'm going to have a conversation with Dr. Deanna Ferree Womack, who teaches history of religions and interfaith studies at Candler School of Theology, Emory University. In this episode, we are going to learn about the historical roots of American Islamophobia and the ways that we can strengthen Muslim and Christian relations. Thank you very much for joining the podcast, Deanna.
Thank you so much, Hui Lan, for the invitation. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Congratulations to the publication of this book, Reinventing Islam, Gender and Protestant Roots in American Islamophobia. Can you share with us why did you write the book?
I wrote the book for several reasons. One is that as a theological educator teaching about Islam in a seminary and writing about Christian-Muslim relations, I wanted to help understand and ultimately challenge anti-Muslim prejudices pervading Protestant culture and the unconscious bias that hinders the work of Christian-Muslim relations. So in the book, I ask, what are some of the thought patterns that laid the groundwork or tilled the soil from which Islamophobia would later grow? What predisposed American Protestant culture toward a particular sort of discourse about Islam? I also wrote the book because I'm a scholar of mission history, and I focus specifically on the Middle East and the wider Islamic world. And I wanted to delve more deeply into the ways that Protestant missionary movements presented Islam, because this was one of the most significant means through which American Protestants received information about Islam and Muslims in the 19th and early 20th century. So I wanted to understand what ideas about Islam missionaries inherited from earlier generations of Protestants and how these ideas changed over time or perhaps remained constant. And then the third reason, or the third sort of lens through which I approached this book, is gender. I wanted to understand how these inherited and reused ideas about Islam connected to Protestant discourses about Muslims and gender specifically. So I apply gender in this study, looking at what Protestant theologians and missionaries said about Muslim men and women, and attending also to the ways that Protestant women specifically contributed to these discourses. Surprisingly, gender has not been a key category of analysis in most studies on Christian-Muslim relations, whether those are focused on missions or on more theological questions. And so ultimately, I'm hoping that the book can teach us something about the history of Protestant thought and activities toward Islam and Muslims, and that we might be able to apply it to our present-day circumstances.
So can you share with us, how did the missionary discourse portrayed Islam or Muslim?
So missionary discourses picked up on some of the themes of earlier Protestant writings beginning in the Reformation, but changed them toward their own specific purposes. So the Protestant missionary enterprise, I look specifically at American Protestants as well as British Protestants, because when it came to missions directed toward Muslims, Americans and British worked very collaboratively in the 19th and early 20th century. And so in terms of Muslim men, they picked up similar discourses that had been passed down to them about Muslim men being threatening, being tyrannical, and they represented them in what we might call today as hyper-masculinity, as having an excess of sexuality or being especially licentious. Those discourses came from the Reformation period, in which the major Muslim power at that time, the Ottoman Empire, was sort of the preeminent civilization and the largest military power in the region at a time when Protestants and European nations were actually afraid of that large power and were most decidedly not major superpowers. Some of those discourses in the past helped to sort of prop up Western Christian motivations when dealing with the power of the Muslim Ottoman Empire. I trace that particular line of discourse from the Reformation into missionary discourses, and I find that in terms of what they were saying about Muslim men, it didn't change much, but the motivations were different. And so this helped Protestants make a case for evangelizing Muslims and for gathering more literature on Islam and for raising more funds for missions in the Islamic world. And then in terms of what missionaries said about Muslim women, this actually changed from the time of the Reformation, where it was much more positive. During the 19th century, missionaries who wrote about Muslim women tended to portray them as being oppressed, imprisoned by their husbands in harems in their homes, and they developed what I called the discourse of the veil that was prevalent across Western society and gave the sense that missionaries needed to actually save Muslim women from the veil itself. That was a symbol of their oppression by Islam, but also by their Muslim husbands. And as you can imagine, Huilan, there are a variety of Protestant missionary perspectives on Islam. Not all of them were as negative, but the basic discourse, and the one that was disseminated widely on both sides of the Atlantic by Anglo-Protestants, was that negative discourse related to gender that I've described.
One special thing about the book is that you do not just examine the missionary discourses by looking at the text. You also look at photos, postcards, and material culture. And what did you find about the presentation of Muslims?
My previous studies have been very textual, but because I'm an archival historian, I've spent a lot of time in mission and church archives. I found that they didn't just save text, published text or scholarly text, but there's actually a wide range of visual and material culture that they preserved and that they used. And so this also helped to influence the ways that Americans and mission supporters were thinking about Islam. So I looked at images of Muslims, for example, and I also looked at the images that missionaries took of themselves dressed in Muslim garb, for example, as a way of portraying Islam. So there's a wide variety of missionary images, including postcards that were used. So people would collect postcards depicting Muslim cultures, groups of people, or individuals. But often I find that these postcards are staged. And so although missionaries are attempting to provide accurate information about the Muslim cultures and peoples that they're working amongst, the images that they disseminated were often created by colonial photographers who were simply making money off of Native people who are being photographed. And often the models in the photos themselves might not be Muslim. They might actually be Middle Eastern Christians, for example, or they might not be members of that particular tribe or group that's labeled on the postcard. So one thing to bear in mind is that many of the images that were disseminated were inaccurate. They purported to be ethnographically accurate in terms of portraying the dress styles and the lives of Muslims, but they were actually often staged and produced in studios. And then in terms of material culture, missionaries collected items of material religion and material culture from the Islamic world, things like rosaries, clothing. And I found one really interesting pattern is that missionaries would often take photographs of themselves wearing the purported garb of Muslims with whom they worked. Or when they went on furlough and they were fundraising and speaking at churches, they would dress up in that Muslim garb and give staged performances. But interestingly, missionaries often bought these costumes when they were on their own vacation. So a missionary from Syria, for example, might travel to Turkey and buy an item of clothing. And then when they went back to the United States, they might wear that item of clothing to portray the Muslim cultures within which they worked. But again, I find that similarly, there's a bit of inaccuracy or misinformation because they're not showing the clothing of the particular people with whom they're working. They're showing the clothing that they bought when they were on vacation in Turkey, for example. But there are countless images in missionary archives of missionaries wearing the garb of Islamic societies.
That is why gender is a very important category to analyze these material artifacts and also the missionary discourse. Why do you think this aspect has been neglected in the past?
I think in terms of the neglect in studies on Christian-Muslim relations, we've often presumed that it's men who are writing about Islam or Muslim men who are able to engage theologically with Christian men. So there's a large body now of great scholarship on Christian-Muslim relations, but it's often very textually focused and very theologically focused. That sort of focus often excludes women from being producers of that knowledge. Although in my study, I show that women missionaries, for example, although they weren't often writing theological texts or large scholarly books, they were producing literature, often literature for children, and they were producing knowledge through the photographic images that they disseminated and through the way that they would dress up as Muslims and portray Islamic cultures. So I think because there's a bias, particularly in Protestant circles and Protestant scholarship, toward texts and texts that men have written. This is one reason that gender hasn't come up as a key category. I think that there's been an interest in theological questions and theological commonalities, and that's something that can bring Christians and Muslims together, at least at the level of clergy and scholars and theologians who are interested in talking with each other. But when you throw gender into the mix, tensions arise because it's a persistent category of thought or analysis or behavior that, at least for Christian-Muslim relations, has been portrayed in a negative way. And so maybe that would be a topic that people would set aside for later. But I believe that if we do that and we don't deal with the conflict over gender, then we can't really move forward in terms of building better Christian-Muslim relations.
After September 11, we have seen rising Islamophobia in American society. Do you think that this earlier missionary discourse contributed at least partly to that development?
Yes, I do. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to undertake this historical study. It's not the only factor, of course, but as I said earlier, missionary discourses tilled the soil, sort of prepared the groundwork for Islamophobia to emerge in the United States. And I would say up until the 1930s, 1940s, even 1950s, missionaries and their discourses, their publications, their images, their presentations were one of the most significant ways that Americans encountered ideas about Islam. This is before the film industry picked up. This is before there was more media tapping into things happening in the Islamic world. And up until that point, this was one really important way that American Protestants were conditioned to think about Islam. And interestingly enough, as at least the mainline Protestants and even Protestant missionaries by the 20th century began to rethink some of those really negative stereotypical discourses and start pursuing closer interfaith and Christian-Muslim relations, those ideas that they had disseminated so widely across American society were already there for the taking. And so we start seeing these things showing up in Hollywood blockbuster films, for example. And so the missionary voices and influence at that point by mid-century begin to dwindle, while other areas of politics, for example, and the media begin to pick up and use those discourses that were already available. So there's a proliferation of discourses about Islam, some that are more positive, some that are more negative. But unfortunately, those that were disseminated by missionaries in the 19th and early 20th century endure. And I see many of those still coming to the forefront today, particularly the sorts of things that are said about gender.
Since the 1960s, there have been more Muslim-Christian dialogue. Do you think that those dialogues have changed much of our perception about Muslim or Islam?
It's a really important achievement to recognize. I think that we have a really long way to go, perhaps, but the beginning of those dialogues and the dialogue work that picked up in the 1990s and the early 2000s, I think has helped a lot more people in the United States understand Islam better and engage in an interfaith dialogue and collaboration in a variety of ways, whether it's theological discussions among scholars or more sort of daily life activities amongst neighbors. So I definitely think that there is an impact. Far more people understand Islamic societies and culture and Islam as a religion today than they did 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And far more people have colleagues and friends and family members who are Muslims and are able to live alongside them in meaningful and harmonious ways. So although we have a lot of challenges ahead of us, the movement of interfaith dialogue has certainly had a positive effect. And even after September 11th, with all the rising Islamophobia, there was also a rising interest among some Americans in learning more about Islam and in more actively pursuing Christian-Muslim relations. And so there's a balance there, recognizing the work that we still need to do, but also recognizing the achievements since the mid-20th century in terms of formal interfaith dialogue work.
You have also written about how Christians and Muslims can build community together. Can you share some of your insights?
So I wrote a book called Neighbors, Christians and Muslims Building Community, and there's a historical aspect to that book. But ultimately, what I aimed to do in that book was to say that it's not enough to just know about Islam and Muslims or to think favorably about Christian-Muslim relations. We actually have to act. And so all the study in the world, all the books in the world, if we don't step up and act, if we don't change our behavior, if we don't reflect on our own thinking and challenge ourselves to address our own biases, then nothing really changes on the ground. And so it's important for us to learn our history, to learn more about our Muslim neighbors, but really the most important thing is face-to-face contact. So to step out of our comfort zone and say hello to someone, to learn to meet our neighbors, to spend time with them, to ask questions about their lives. If we allow a dividing wall to be between us and we don't actually engage as people with each other, then the hostilities continue, the misinformation continues. But if I know my Muslim neighbor and I understand what they might be going through, or if I learn from their perspective on what it's like to live as a religious minority in the United States, for example, then I can not only change the way I think, but I can change the way that I engage with my community as an educator or as a person in my church, for example. Learning about Islam and Christian-Muslim relations is important, but stepping out of the comfort zone to act and to change our behavior and to come into relationship with people is really the most important thing in terms of improving Christian-Muslim understanding.
I know that you teach interfaith studies at Candler School of Theology. Can you share some of your pedagogy? How do you help people who have grown up in primarily Christian environments to learn about Islam or to overcome some of their misperceptions?
My pedagogy is very similar to what I explained in terms of my scholarship on building Christian-Muslim community. The first thing is to let students know they don't have to be an expert on Islam. And I found particularly Protestant students or even Protestant church audiences, they want to know everything about the history of Islam and the Quran. And what I say is we will learn as we go, but it's actually important to be able to learn about Islam from Muslims. You don't have to know everything about the religion in order to build friendships with each other. So in my courses, I tend not to be reading theology or spending a whole lot of time on the intricacies of history or interpreting the Quran, but rather to read about Muslim Americans. For example, I have a course called Islam in America, and to read the scholarship that Muslim Americans have published, for example. So those are things we can do in the classroom. But the other aspect is that we have to get to know Muslim communities in our own cities and in this country. And so as much as possible, I try to invite guest speakers or even a group of Muslims. For example, there's an Islamic seminary in the Atlanta area. And so I've had students from that seminary come and have meals with our students, or simply go to tour a mosque or to observe Friday prayers. These sorts of more tactile and face-to-face engagement really help Christian students, and especially those who haven't grown up in places where they've had Muslim neighbors. It helps my students to not only understand Islam, but to understand Muslims and to be able to learn about Islam and Muslim life from American Muslim neighbors. So that's the thing that makes a difference. And that's been really important in terms of my pedagogy, to have that face-to-face contact and a basis for relationship building. And I have found that some of my students have gone on to continue being in relationship with people that we've met at mosque visits or at dialogue dinners.
Given the wars and conflicts in the Middle East, what do you see as the contribution as someone who studied Middle Eastern Christianity?
One of the things that I stress, whether studying Christian-Muslim relations or studying the Middle East or trying to build interfaith relations, is that it's really dangerous to generalize about large populations of people. The Islamic world is a very wide and diverse area, and to say that it's one specific thing really doesn't do justice to a diverse set of cultures and histories and people, for example. And so for Americans thinking about the Middle East, we often think about Islam, and we often think particularly about acts of violence that we associate with Islam. And so the question that I ask in my book, and I would continue asking to others when thinking about conflicts in the Middle East, is why is it that the violent actions of certain Muslims in one particular Middle Eastern context prompt some Americans, for example, to attack their Muslim neighbors as if in retribution? So we see something that one particular group does, and we judge an entire population based on that. And then a question for other Americans who would never even consider verbally or physically attacking anyone is, why do so many Americans look on in silence when these things happen, when mosques are attacked or burned, when Muslim women in the United States have their hijabs or their headscarf ripped off? And so the consequences of what happens in the Middle East are not only tremendous for the people there, but they're also tremendous for people in the United States who are judged to be part of particular groups that are taking part in those conflicts. And so our world is very small, but I think that we need to step back and we need to understand the diversity of the cultures and the peoples of the Middle East. And we also need to take a moment for self-reflection and understand why, when we see certain images, we tend to think certain negative and prejudicial thoughts about our neighbors here in the U.S.
Thank you very much for joining the podcast today. If you find the podcast valuable, please click like, comment, and subscribe. I will see you in the next episode.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.